فكلي واشربي وقري عينا فإما ترين من البشر أحدا فقولي إني نذرت للرحمن صوما.
Hey everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to A Common Word and the Islamic Married Podcast. So, A Common Word podcast focuses on Islam and interreligious studies, inspired by the Quranic verse 364, which calls the people of the book to a common word, and a Common Word initiative held in 2007 in Amman, Jordan. It interviews scholars, activists, and practitioners in the realm of bridge building, peace studies, and social justice. Today I had the opportunity to interview Shawkat Toorawa. Shawkat Toorawa is a scholar I've been following for a long time. When I began writing my book on the Islamic Mary, I was attracted to the chapter of Mary, Maryam, in the Qur'an. And as I began to look and read the chapter, I was drawn to Shawkat's work in the Journal of Quranic Studies on the chapter of Maryam. He explained how the chapter of Maryam has a unique rhyme scheme. It mentions the word Rahman, or the most merciful or compassionate, several times, and it has a unique word for love, widda, in the chapter itself. I was excited to see that Shawkat had written a new book entitled The Devotional Qur'an. In this interview, I sit down with Shawkat to talk about his spiritual autobiography, his background, and read some of the actual translations he puts together in the book. Hello everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Islamic Mary and the A Common Word podcast. So for today, we're super excited to have Dr. Shawkat Toorawa, someone who I've been following for a long time and I admire his work deeply. And he'll be here to speak about his book, The Devotional Qur'an. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
All right, wonderful. So one of the things we always do in the beginning of the show is for the guests to speak about their spiritual biography and how that led them to write their particular work. So please.
So spiritual biography is a tricky one. I was raised in a Muslim household, observant parents, but I lived in Muslim minority context, right? So my parents are from the island, they passed away, from the island of Mauritius, but they met in England, and I was born there, and then I grew up in London, in Paris, in Hong Kong, and then in Singapore. And it wasn't until I reached Singapore that I was in a place that had more than a very small percentage of Muslims. And so a lot of the process of raising me involved exposing me to Islam in ways that had to be manufactured, as it were, right? I mean, there was the Central Mosque in Paris. I remember going there with my dad for Friday prayers. But it was really lots of books that my father would buy and place in the home, which I would happen across, right? So stories of the Sahaba or different translations of the Qur'an, biographies. I was fortunate to go to a very good school. My English was good. My French was good. I was reading this stuff from quite young. By the time I got to Singapore at the age of 10 or so, it was clear that at that point, in addition to or beyond being taught how to read Qur'an, which is something I learned from a Senegalese Azhar graduate in Paris, my parents both, but my father specifically decided that I should have a private teacher. I wasn't able to go to the Singaporean equivalent of the madrasa because they accommodated Singapore school schedules, and I was going to a foreign school. So we engaged a teacher, Maulvi Babu Sahib, who was a Tamil Singaporean alim, and he used to come to my house, and it was great. He used to teach me Aqidah and fiqh and other things based on this Arwi text, because he was trained in Tamil in India, and he was Shafi, but he was teaching me Hanafi law because I was Hanafi or Hanafi practice. He was an influential figure for me. Asked him lots of questions. He was, I think it's fair to say, very religiously conservative, but not socially. That is to say, he understood that Singapore was multicultural, that you needed to live with other people, that science was important, that progress was important. So I was in a context of family that was a cosmopolitan, I guess is one way to describe it. Muslim family. I had a relatively cosmopolitan set of teachers So I think of myself as being the product of a cosmopolitan spirituality as opposed to a very singular, right? So although it was Hanafism, although I should say my mother was born and raised Bori, Dawdi Bora, which she shed actually when she met my dad and practiced Sunni. But a lot of my closest friends growing up, a lot of the families we spent time with were Boras just because of the family affinities. And I remember I was at speaking to the vice chancellor of the University of Malaya, when my parents were living in Malaysia. My father took me to meet him. And he said to me, he said, so if I understand this right, your garden is Sunni, but many of the trees in the orchard are Shia. And I said, that's a fantastic way of describing this. And I'd extend that and say, I think of my spiritual life as being a garden, right, with many different kinds of flowers and ponds and birds and so on, and they come from different places. So in Singapore, I met another very influential figure on me who was a Qadiri sheikh. I didn't take bay'ah, but became influential and important in helping me think about things. So that's where the spiritual life or the spiritual side comes from. I mean, of course, the person I should credit the most is my mother. As we all know, it's I don't for a fact remember, but I can only imagine that it was my mother who first taught me how to recite certain surahs, would read Ayatul Kursi with me at night before going to sleep. And these are practices that my wife continued with our children and that I continued. So I feel very much part of, silsila is probably the wrong word, but very much part of a tradition of, I guess, South Asian cosmopolitan Islam. And I just want to specify that cosmopolitan is not meant to be a substitute for progressive, or which I am, certainly politically, or it's not a placeholder. I literally mean someone who grew up in many different places and was exposed to many different varieties of Islam. And so even though I perform or practice or embody or appear to one of them, I actually think of myself as constituted by lots of these strands.
Oh wow, yeah, absolutely. And I could definitely see that in the book. There's so much going on, whether Islam and literature and rhyme. So your cosmopolitan background definitely emerges. So could you speak about your book in particular, the title? In particular, why did you pick verses and chapters to translate? For instance, you mentioned that Surat Maryam, a chapter that you translated for the Journal of Quranic Studies, is not part of the devotional practices. So you didn't include it, but included other surahs like Surah Yasin.
Yeah, so the book has a history or a prehistory, which is I started translating surahs, typically short ones, which I then published in the Journal of Quranic Studies, and that became kind of the place that was publishing them. So in the end, I started publishing them for the Journal of Quranic Studies, and it was mainly driven. That move on my part was driven by the desire to produce translations that paid attention to the rhyme and the rhythm in the surahs. I had noticed from very young, actually, I had noticed that translators in all languages paid very little attention to that. It had not bothered me too much. I understood more or less what the translations were saying. At the age of 18, I started actually learning Arabic. I already knew how to read it, but I started to learn it because this is what I decided to major in. And so, in a way, the need for the translation diminished slightly. I got interested in Arabic literature, not in the Quran. So I paid not that much attention to the Quran, other than in devotional life or in as much as authors might quote or cite the Quran. But two things happened. One is I started teaching a course on the Quran at Cornell and was frustrated that there wasn't really a very good translation. There were serviceable ones, but not a very good one. And around the same time, my daughters, who were Anglophone, growing up in the States at that point, when they would ask me what something meant, I realized that when I went to a translation, often that translation was anywhere from, and I say this with no disrespect, from gibberish as a rendering, extremely inaccessible and wooden. And I thought, what if one did something that was a little bit different? But the main thing I noticed was that no one paid attention to rhyme. So I started doing that. And over the years, many years, translations appeared in the Journal of Quranic Studies. And in that time, colleagues, which is the main readership for that journal, said, "Oh, this is great. You're doing a great job. Thank you. This is helpful. When we teach the Quran, we can give students this and they can hear some of that." But it also became increasingly clear to me as I read those translations with distance, right, after a few years and so on, that they too were wooden. And even though a lot of attention was being paid to rhyme and rhythm, I wasn't really producing translations that were, for want of a better word, beautiful
or
appealing. Let's say appealing instead of beautiful, appealing.
Yeah.
And didn't really have a view on that, but realized that. I came to a kind of rapid realization. A lot of people said to me, colleagues said to me, why don't you put the translations together in a book? Why don't you bring it together? Why don't you translate the whole Quran? I have never had any interest in translating the whole Quran. I thought maybe a book is a good idea, but how does one organize? I mean, how could I publish a book that's essentially surahs I have translated over the years, right? I mean, that's essentially what they were. So I took a long, hard look at what I translated and realized that most of what I had translated were surahs and that are of what I was then calling liturgical interest to Muslims, ones that they use in forms of devotion and devotional practice. And I thought, well, that's an interesting idea. What if I imagine a book that consists of those passages and those surahs that Muslims use in their devotional life? That would be a reasonable way to circumscribe a set of surahs. And I ran that idea by friends, by colleagues, and they all thought it was a great idea. And they said, that sounds like a good idea. It's meaningful, it's defensible, right? Which was my main concern. It's defensible. And you've already done many, evidently, of the ones that you would include. Of course, I had not done all the ones that I would include because I realized that there were important surahs missing. But I also realized that there were surahs I had translated. You've mentioned Maryam, which I translated and published, but I've done others like Surah Luqman and some others. Surah Yusuf, I just recently translated and published Surah Yusuf as a play script.
Oh, wow.
And those do not make it into this book because although it's true that there are no doubt some parts of the world where Muslims might use those surahs in devotional context. For example, I know that in Egypt, sometimes Surah Maryam is recited by women who are expecting or who want to conceive. But it's not a widespread practice. And I thought I should at least put together a book in which everything that's in it, people will recognize as being appropriate to it and not worry about what might be missing. So it's entirely possible that someone, yourself, anyone might say, well, it would have been nice if you'd included Surah Dukhan. Would have been nice if you'd included Surah Fat. Yes, absolutely. But no one, I think, and certainly no one has so far, looked at one passage or entry and said, why is that in there? That doesn't belong, right? And because I realized that it was important for me to also show that that was the case, not just assert that these are devotional surahs, I include this small appendix, which is really the only scholarly apparatus in the book, really, to speak of, in which I say, here are a series of booklets and wazifas and things in the world of Muslims where they're told, here you should recite the following, and I show the overlap between what I've selected and what those books contain, just so that the uninitiated reader is secure in the knowledge that what I've selected, in fact, is part. So Muslims recognize them immediately and say, oh, that makes sense. Oh, that's right. I see why that's there. But a non-Muslim might say, well, how is this? Isn't this just Toorawa putting his Sunni or his South Asian or his American academic stamp on it? And I wanted to remove that and say, no, this is what the world of Muslims values. This is a subset of what the world of Muslims value. And so that's why Maryam's not in there, and it's one of my favorite surahs.
Yeah, and I would encourage folks to look at the appendix. I actually looked at some of those wadifas, and as you mentioned, those are found within the Muslim world, but they may not always be known. That a lot of Muslims may not be aware of these devotional texts. And you're right, in my teaching of Quranic studies and also devotional practices, it's either someone translates the whole Quran or or nothing at all. So I think I found this really unique, you finding a way to focus on some key passages that are relevant and important.
Well, as
So
you know,
can
there is a
yeah.
there is a tradition of selections, right? So in the American Academy, there's of course Michael Sell's
Yes.
approaching the Quran, the early revelations, where he focused on the Meccan surahs. There are in all those wazifas and so on a selection of surahs that are included. Mahmud Ayub translated Juz Amma, right? He called the whole thing the Great Tiding. There is a tradition of doing this, and of course, even within the Muslim tradition, right, there isn't this idea that the Quran only functions as the entire text. It does, in fact, operate in different ways and different pieces of it, as it were. So that was also reassuring to me, as it were. I wasn't doing something. I mean, I was perfectly happy. I was perfectly happy to be radical, but I was pleased that for something as important as this, it wasn't some radical departure from what's available in the tradition. It's in fact something that the tradition does.
That's a great point. Then, since you mentioned Michael Sells and Mahmoud Ayub, would you say your work builds off them or draws from them, or what would you say your relationship between those authors are?
I would say this book as an initiative is inspired on, dependent on the initiative that Michael Sells took, that Mahmoud Ayub took, but I did not use their translations or turn to them.
Hmm.
I'm a huge admirer of Michael Sells as a scholar and a translator. I'm not a great lover of his translations approaching the Quran. I think, he also had a specific point he was trying to make, which he successfully made about the way that the language works. So I liken those translations to my Journal of Quranic Studies translation.
Mm.
Whereas what I try to do with the Devotional Quran is also address another audience. Well, I had two other desiderata. One was thereby to point out to anyone who was willing to pay attention, but I specifically had in mind my colleagues, your and my colleagues both, in the Western world who study Quran, that the surahs that matter to Muslims are not necessarily the surahs that they study or that we study. In fact, writing about Surah Maryam, which both of you and I have done, is part of what we would do. We do because we are part of the academy. And we realize that Surah Maryam is a surah that deserves our scholarly, academic, interreligious, whatever, attention, right? How many articles are there on Surah Yasin? How many conferences are there in which Surah Yasin figures? Very few. And yet, Yasin may be the surah that is the non-short surah that is the most widely recited, used, invoked, probably in the world. And it's quite amazing. It was quite amazing to me that really none of our colleagues pay any attention to Surah Yasin. And I thought it would be nice to have a book in which, which basically says, here are the ones that actually matter.
Yeah.
These are the ones that matter. And there's overlap, of course. Surah Kaf 18 is very important to Muslim devotional practice and also very interesting to scholars. And by Western, I don't just mean non-Muslim. I mean the modern enterprise of the study of the Quran, whether it's by Muslims or non-Muslims, but in the West, in Western languages. So that was one. And then the other was I noticed some years back when I was many years back, looking for passages of the Quran in translation to assign to students, that the Norton Anthology of World Literature and the Longman Anthology of World Literature had excerpts of Quran in them.
Hmm.
And I thought to myself, when reading those excerpts, those translations, the reader who is interested in world literature, interested in high-level literature from around the world, from different contexts, different time periods, would immediately understand why the Quran has been included because of its significance as a text. But there really was nothing about the actual translation that led one to believe that this was world literature of great quality.
Hmm.
And I thought it was important to at least try to translate the Quran in a way that when people read it, they get a sense of that beauty and that awe and that gravitas that the Arabic does have, that even non-Muslim readers of the Arabic recognize and say, this is an amazing piece of writing or amazing recitation, however one wants to think about it. Certainly an amazing piece of literature. And so that was another idea is, try and produce translations, which is why my Journal of Quranic Studies ones had to undergo some changes because they were quite wooden. And I wanted something that someone could read out loud and just on reading or on hearing it say, okay, I get it. I get why they, whoever they is, say this is an important piece of writing. This is literary. This has qualities that Muslims even go as far as saying are inimitable.
Hmm.
So I obviously haven't succeeded in that, but I gesture toward that, I think, in some of the translations, or I attempt.
Yes. No, I agree. And since you mentioned world literature, I teach here at Shenandoah University and I teach in general education. Do you see a class on the Quran as part of the great books or part of a canon that students in Western academia should look at or study or?
Sure, I think there have to be parameters. One has to decide. Certainly it belongs uh, a, a course on important texts. If by great one means books that have had an impact on human society, absolutely. But I think it's also fair to say that there's a big difference between reading Ulysses by James Joyce and reading the Quran, right? Or by reading Hamlet and reading the Quran. I mean, there are generic genre differences. Is also a question of impact, and we know that if we're looking at the King James Bible and English literature, one can make the connections between the King James translation and how that has impacted English literature. It will be harder, it will be impossible to have students read the Quran in translation and then try to demonstrate how it's had a similar impact on Arabic literature and on the
Mhm.
literatures in the languages where Muslims have in which Muslims have written. Yeah, so I think it belongs, but I can also imagine a course in which it would not be present, right? I think that one of the difficulties we have, you and I and others, is on the one hand, we feel correctly, I think, that the materials from the traditions that we study belong in a course or a series of courses on the world and on world literature. On the other hand, it has to be done in a way that is not too instrumental and too tokenized, right?
Mhm.
So I think maybe a chapter from the Quran, chapter from the a part of the Rig Vedas or part of the Bhagavad Gita, part. I mean, I think as a part of a selection of different ways in which authors, right? Because inevitably one has to talk about authors, have engaged with the divine, for example. I mean, that I
Mhm.
think would be really powerful for students in a world literature course, so that they can situate it somehow. The Quran,
Mm.
as you know, is a very, in the form that we have it, is a very decontextualized text. And it's hard to just give the Quran to a student and say, here, read.
Yeah.
It's a great piece of writing. That's a challenge.
No, that makes sense, and you're right. So maybe we can move to what make your translations unique. So of course, there's tons of translations out there, different styles, but what really draws me to your translation and something you speak about yourself is the rhyme or the saj'a. In particular, you make these 4 points in the introduction. You say, first, I want to show that difficult as it is to translate the Quran while being attentive to rhyme is certainly not impossible. Second, I want to demonstrate that meaning inheres in the deployment of sounds in the Quran. Third, I want to convince readers and listeners that the sonorous qualities of the Quranic Arabic can be conveyed to a non-Arabic readership and listenership. And fourth, I want to make clear that inattention to the original's rhetorical and literary character comes at a great cost. One only underscored by the fact that millions of readers interact with the Quran in translation. So that really nicely summarizes your thinking behind your specific translation. Could you provide a commentary of this and explain this further
Oh,
for us?
oh, well, one other thing I want to say was I couldn't have said it better myself, but then of course I said that. So that took me a long, it took me a long time to write that paragraph, which is from the introduction to the book, because I thought, okay, what is it I'm doing? Right?
Hmm.
I have to be explicit. What am I doing? I hesitate to call my translations unique. I'd say it's an attempt to move the needle
Hmm.
in Quran translation in an attempt to show the importance of sound. That is to say, sound matters for the Quran. I
Hmm.
want to show in translations that sound matters. One of the things that has tripped people up, including me, is this idea that the sound has to operate exactly the same way that it operates in the Arabic. And it was when I realized that that didn't need to be the case that I was able to, well, feel liberated actually from that, from what I would actually call the tyranny of the Arabic syntax, right? So
Mm.
people felt, and oh well, it's phrased in a particular way, I have to phrase it that way. But if you phrase English with Arabic syntax, then it's not going to sound sonorous. It's going to sound forced. It's going to sound wooden. I mean, if I were a poet, maybe I could make it sound good, but I'm not a poet. And so the challenge was being attentive to rhyme. And maybe that sentence should have said, while being attentive to rhyme and rhythm, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think, as I recall, I only wrote rhyme in that sentence because there are translators who have said, I have been attentive to rhythm. I've paid attention to cadence. A recent translation by Rafi Habib and Bruce Lawrence has appeared with Norton, in which they use English verse to try and do just that. How successful people have been varies widely, based not only on their choices, but also on their abilities. And I've never been terribly happy with any of that. And so I was trying to, as I said, move the needle a bit by showing that it was actually possible to do. Not here it is, I've done it, but it's possible to do it. Right. So that's what I meant by difficult it is to translate while being attentive. It is not impossible. Because there are people who say, oh, it's impossible. And they just foreclose on everything. You know, the late, great translator Humphrey Davis, who I don't believe ever translated the Qur'an, except in the context of other things he was translating. He was once asked about the poet Mutanabbi. He was asked, you know, people say Mutanabbi is untranslatable. What do you think? And he said, there are only two positions. Either everything is translatable or nothing is translatable. And he's just so right? Because the problem with saying it's not possible to translate something is it forecloses on everything.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to translate. And of course, the Quran itself is a translation. God is, according to the Quran, beyond anything humans can describe or conceive of. He therefore cannot be constrained by human language. This Arabic Quran is a translation through revelation into a human language. And so this idea that it's impossible, is tied to theological ideas about inimitability and so on. So I'm not something I'm interested in. Right. So I also wanted to show that meaning inheres in the deployment of sounds. I'll just give you one example. The very beginning of Surah Baqarah, the closing word of the first three ayahs all have qafs in them. Why? There has to be a reason. So one reason could be, well, it's part of the rhythmic literary structure, right? The fact is, those are very important verses, right? Those verses are about belief. And so I think to not realize that those sounds are being deployed in a specific way. Now, I can imagine someone coming along, someone who's trying to construct some kind of explanation. They might say, oh, well, the qaf is just like the qaf of qul, or so on. I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested in a kind of I'm very interested in the metaphysical, but I'm not interested in a metaphysical explanation for the literary text. But it's clear that sounds operate in a particular way. It's clear that a surah like Inshirah, like Alam Nashrah Laka Sadrak, is full of very hard, dark Arabic letters. Purpose. These sound is being deployed. These are not accidental choices, right? They're being deployed in a particular way. So that's important. The sonorous qualities of the Quran being conveyed to a non-Arabic readership, this is part of the idea that, well, it's impossible to do in English what the Arabic does. I'm willing to concede that. It's impossible to do in any language what the original language does. But it is possible to do in the target language things that the target language is good at, and thereby show the sophistication of a text. So I thought that was important to do. And my fourth point that you mentioned was what the cost is, right? So, and maybe I'll reread this. So, and fourth, I want to make clear that inattention to the original's rhetorical and literary character comes at a great cost, one only underscored by the fact that many millions of readers interact with the Quran in translation. So this is the idea that we've kind of accepted as readers of the Quran, that it's okay not to pay attention to sound. Right? Because we haven't, right, typically. And therefore, that must be okay. So when I say to people, well, I pay attention to rhyme, they say, well, aren't you worried that you're sacrificing meaning? And my answer is usually, what makes you think that the way you're doing it isn't sacrificing meaning? Just decided, as a kind of baseline, meaning does not exist in the rhyme. Meaning only exists in the literal, almost exact translation of the Arabic syntax. That's where the meaning resides. And I think that's absolutely not the case. And the reality is that the sound and the rhetorical and literary structures, which are not just syntax, also are repositories of the meaning. And we have to try and find a way in English to convey those. So that's my general strategy.
Oh, great. Yeah, that I really found that introduction helpful to give the kind of theory behind your translation and how you're going about translating. So, since this podcast touches upon Islam and interreligious studies, could you speak about various Christian or biblical influences? We already spoke about Surat Maryam and also the King James Bible. So, you are a scholar of not just the Quran, but of literature. How has the Western canon or the Christian biblical tradition influence your work?
So I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I think it's inevitable as someone who went to English language schools almost my whole life. Kindergarten was in preschool was in French, but everything else after that was in English. And it's impossible, right, for someone, especially someone who's interested in literature, that is not only just as an academic, but I'm an avid reader. I've been very fortunate to have read a lot of the English literary tradition. It's impossible not to have been impacted by the rhythms of the King James Bible and the way that it's worked throughout literature, but also just other translations and things biblical. I think in that sense, I must be very impacted by it. But I don't and haven't typically turned to, I'm not a scholar of religion. I'm not a
Hmm.
scholar of Christianity. I was a unofficial medieval studies major in school and know a lot about medieval Christianity and the papacy and so on. But I wouldn't say that I'm a scholar of Christianity. So I'm not sure that a lot of it impacted me in in doing the translations. Perhaps the one exception is in my translation of Surah in Shirah, which I mentioned, which I originally, which, as you know, opens Alam Nashrah Laka Sadrak, and which I originally translated, "Did we not your breast prize open?" Believe it or
Hmm.
not, terrible translation. And it's only, that really bothered me a lot. I thought, I can't believe I thought that it was okay to translate something that way. Besides the fact that I didn't even think that's what it meant. That is to say, I've often felt that that has to be about consolation, just like it is elsewhere in the Quran, where is it Moses? I can't remember, who says Ishrah li sadri, which
Hmm.
doesn't mean prise my breast open, right?
Hmm.
It means, calm me down. And so that translation now in the book, instead of opening, "Did we not your breast prise open?" now opens, "Didn't I soothe your heart when you were down?"
Mm.
And I close that. The surah, as you know, closes with "Inna ma'al usri yusran, inna ma'al," well, it doesn't close, but toward the end is "Inna ma'al usri yusran, inna ma'al usri yusra." That now reads, "This shall pass, this too shall pass." Most readers who are aware of it have looked at me and said, "Well, that's a very Christian way of translating that." And to which my answer would be, it is true that the expression "this shall pass" is something that emanates from the Christian tradition, but it's become part of the general fund of the language.
Mm.
We know people have used that in non-religious contexts. Even
Yeah.
friends might say, "Don't worry, this will pass," or "This shall pass." So I felt entitled. I think that's the only direct use in a translation that does not appear in the book, that is in the Journal of Quranic Studies, though. I translate a particular passage as, "I am this is the Omega and the Alpha," instead of
Hmm.
beginning and end. And that too is something that I pulled in, but I didn't pull it from Christianity. I pulled it from the English language.
Gotcha. Okay,
And
great.
it's not that I have any problem with Christianity, to be very clear. It's just that I don't think that that's how this has entered, right? It has entered through my exposure to literature.
To literature in general. All right, wonderful. So maybe we could speak about some of your translations. So we've spoken about your background, the introduction. Now we can dive into some of the translations themselves. In particular, that of Surah Fatiha, of course, the most important chapter in the Quran, especially in terms of devotional practices. Do you mind reading this for us? And then you can maybe give a commentary, take us behind the scenes of what you're doing here with the translation.
Sure. Okay, so in the name of God, ever compassionate and full of compassion. Praise God, Lord of all creation, ever compassionate and full of compassion, Master of Judgment Day. You alone we beseech, and to you alone we pray. Guide us to the right path, the path of those who please you, not of those who earn your wrath or who have gone astray. Amen.
Great. So yeah, that was beautiful. So could you speak a little bit about how you're incorporating sound or some
Sure,
of the words you choose? Yeah.
sure. So, as is clear from the Basmala, which also appears in the opening of the Surah Fatiha, I wanted Rahman and Rahim to both be the same word because of the shared root. So, as you know, people often say the beneficent, the merciful, any number of different ways. I thought it was important to have the word compassion in both. And quite a long time ago, decided that that was the only responsible way to translate it from my perspective. Hence that translation. And it's important because then it appears in the surah. Something like praise God. I can't tell you how many times I've wanted to pull my hair out when people say things like praise be to God. No one says
Hmm.
that, right? No one says that. It's wooden. It's not English. It just makes no sense to me. And it's so
Hmm.
simple to just say praise God. I mean, one could say God be praised. And
Hmm.
I did consider that. God be praised. But the problem is, well, a problem for me was that this surah tends to be prescriptive, and I wanted it to be potentially read as a command,
Hmm.
right? So this is an example, I suppose, of using what English can do, right? In Arabic, you could not confuse the indicative verb and the imperative, but in English you can. And so that's a resource that English has that can be put to use, right? So that's one of the things I try to think about. The rhyme is relatively clear: compassion, creation, day, pray, path, wrath. Sorry, day, pray, astray, path. But and beseech does not rhyme with anything. And the one of the things I learned from Peter Cole, the great poet and translator to whom I showed this before I dared show it to the world, once said to me, the best rhymes are the ones that you don't notice.
Hmm.
And I think it's important. That was an important lesson because there were times when I wanted it to rhyme, but there were times when I wanted to sort of make sure that it didn't, as it were, so it wouldn't sound like doggerel or like limerick,
Mm.
right? Which is what happens. And so what I do with beseech is beseech and please are the two that both contain this long e sound, right? And so there's
Hmm.
still a way in which they relate. Now there are choices that I've made that have annoyed some people. When I was at the book launch for this book at SOAS at the University of London,
Hmm.
one of the people asking the question was quite unhappy that I had inverted. So instead of saying to you alone we pray and you alone we beseech, I inverted it.
Hmm.
And he said, how can you do that? And I said, well, first of all, I'm this is what it does in the English. I'm not
Hmm.
suggesting that the Arabic be reordered. The Arabic is
Hmm.
doing what the Arabic does. It doesn't read as well in English to pray and then beseech. It works
Hmm.
better in English to beseech and then pray. And I also said to him, but I think it was lost on him because he was quite exercised about this, that the in that very same ayah, the word order is inverted in order to preserve rhyme. So instead of saying
Hmm.
it says وَإِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ so that it rhymes.
Hmm.
And so I felt perfectly authorized to do an inversion because the line itself does an inversion. Right? And so this is another example of trying to do things in the English that the Arabic is doing without it necessarily having to be the identical thing. Right? So I didn't change word order, but I did change the sentence order in the English. And the rest of it is, I mean, it's fairly straightforward. But it is the case that if you're going to say path, then wrath suggests itself. Rhyme is of course very hard in English, but it's not. But English is not rhyme poor. It's just harder to do
Hmm.
than it is in Arabic. Some languages, because of Arabic's morphological structures, it's easier to rhyme. Because if English doesn't have a morphologically based, or at least not a system of forms that are based on morphology, it is harder to do. But it is not impossible.
Hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned that inversion here. So I'm curious, there is this debate, as you know better in translation studies, of the literal versus more the meaning. So would you say you lean more to the meaning, general meaning, or how would you?
I would say I try with every, with a short surah, I can do the whole thing. I mean, anyone can take the whole package. With longer ones in segments, I try to get a sense of what is trying to be conveyed, and then I try to convey that.
Hmm.
So I suppose that answer means that I'm looking at meaning. But
Hmm.
the Quran is an ancient, quirky, archaic text, and I don't want to lose that when I'm doing what I'm doing. It's
Hmm.
important for me to make sure, for example, beseech, not a common word, right? Not a common word. I mean, but it was important to me to have a word like that in there because it needed to retain some of that character. And I think
Hmm.
that's another mistake that I think people, myself included, have made and make, which is in order to make it sound like God or to make it sound old, then use inverted syntax or use Victorian English. You don't need to do that. There are other ways of doing that. You can just throw in a specific word, a word that's slightly, more obsolete, and it can change the character of an entire passage. That's all you really need to do. Or just
Hmm.
invert a word order once. And the whole thing then acquires that because it kind of has a hue about it, as opposed to trying to be, with every single sentence, trying to be Victorian or archaic.
Yeah, I noticed that reading your translation, there's no thys and thous in terms of trying to elevate the language to sound more Victorian or King James like. So,
Yeah, none of
but
that.
there are these words like wrath or beseech that are elevated. They aren't just their common everyday speech. So, are wonderful. So maybe we could look at another one here that I found very impactful. It was Surah Ikhlas. And yeah, do you mind reading that for us and also doing the same thing, just taking us behind the scenes of how you translate?
In the name of God, ever compassionate and full of compassion. Declare God is peerless, God is flawless, unbegetting and birthless, without any partner, matchless. So this is one of the surahs. So whenever a new translation comes out of the Quran, of the entire Quran comes out, or even of partial translations, I go and I always look at the Fatiha, the opening of Surah Baqarah, Surah Ikhlas, Surah Inshirah, and Surah Zilzala. If those five don't pass my little bar, I don't use that translation because I figure those are fairly short passages. It's not that hard to not screw up, right? And Ikhlas is one of them because I remember once, and I don't remember whether what I'm about to describe came before I made a decision to translate or after, but I do remember once one of my daughters, I don't remember which, asking about the meaning of Surah Ikhlas, and we read a translation that was at hand, and it said, "Say He is God one." My daughter looked at me and said, "What does that mean?" And I said, "That's a really good question. I'm not entirely sure what 'say He is God one' means." She goes, "Well, what does it mean?" I said, "Well, it's saying you should believe that there is only one God." And then she said, "Why doesn't it say that?" And I thought to myself, exactly. Why doesn't it say that? Right? Why doesn't it say? So, a couple of things. One of them is declare. So I think not I think, I know, one of the great losses in Quran translation is the decision by translators to translate kul every time as say.
Hmm.
And yes is the imperative from the verb to say, but any reader of Arabic knows that means he said, means he answered, means he continued. I mean, it means any number of things. It's a very versatile verb in Arabic. And it struck me here as elsewhere in the Quran where it says, including these four surahs that are called the four kul, right? The four surahs that begin with the word, that it doesn't mean say, right? It might mean something like affirm, declare,
Hmm.
believe. And so I thought that in the case of Ikhlas, since it is a creedal statement, and since we talk about a declaration of faith and when we declare things, we have some attachment to it. I thought declare would work very nicely as the translation for kul. And then when translating, say he is God one, I thought I need to find a way that is both categorical but also gentle. And
Mm.
actually, Peter Cole said to me when he saw this, he said, I like it, the poet. I like it, but the Arabic ends in hard letters, right? It's E, right? And you've gone with S, which is a sibilant in English, and it's soft. And I said,
Mm.
yes, agreed. But the fact that it's a negative, peerless, flawless, I said, for me, captures some of what the surah is trying to do. Because, in a larger theological sense as well, a lot of the creedal statements, La ilaha illallah is a negative statement, right? There is no God but God. And I just thought, you know, peerless worked well. And so I thought, okay, let me see that. And then I thought flawless. Then flawless came. I think it started out as God is matchless, and then flawless just flowed naturally. And I thought this is perfect because there's all this polemic and discussion and criticism, literary criticism around what the word samad means. And who knows? A lot of people go with something like eternal or long lasting and so on. But certainly at root, the word is something that's intact. And possibly it's something like a rock in which there is no fissure. And I thought, well, flawless, which will, of course, invoke a diamond in people's minds, like this perfect thing, perfection. I thought worked really well for that. And then I had to do unbegetting and birthless, and begetting unbegetting is an example of again of using a slightly archaic term. Birthless, of course, is not a word, and I was perfectly comfortable doing that because samad is a hapax. It's a word that
Mm.
occurs only once, and I thought, well, there's no harm using a word that probably will appear only once, also in my translation, and so birthless. The hardest part was the closing verse. In the case of the Arabic, it's the same word, right? It's ahad, both in the first position, first ayah, qul huwallahu ahad, and then lam yakun lahu, right? Kufuwan ahad. It's the same word, but I thought this is another example of the word not meaning the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another thing that translators do. They will try to translate every word the same way, as if all words only ever mean one thing in language. And maybe one would be entitled to think that if the Quran had been put together in an instant, but evidently it was received by people, or maybe it was put together in an instant, but it was certainly not received in an instant. But it was received over time. And so I thought, no, I'm not going to put, I think it was matchless in position one and in position four, matchless both times. I'm just going to use another word that just means the same thing. And so peerless, matchless. And match I liked because, without any partner, the idea is that it's not just that there is no peer, but there is a sense, at least according to the theologians, in which it's meant to be a refutation of God having a spouse. And of course, the word match evokes that. So
Mm.
it worked pretty well for me. People have responded well to this translation. In some ways, I mean, it's both one of the ones that's most distant from the Arabic syntax, but also one that is, I guess paradoxically the most successful for people when they read it. And in a way, that's great vindication for me. It's like, okay, maybe this is how we need to be doing things because this has invited people into the surah in ways that these translations that my daughter couldn't handle in fact keep people outside of the surah and outside of the Quran because they can't get into it. They can't make sense of it. And surely that is not the intention. The intention is in fact to invite people into the text and into its meanings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. When I read this myself, I was awestruck with the rhyme, the peerless, flawless, birthless, matchless, and also the meaning is very clear, and I think does capture what the chapter is all about. And I found this interesting here, the hyphen, which is also the punctuation that you use sometimes in your translation. So here you have declare, and then you have this hyphen, and then without any partner hyphen, and then matchless. So that is a
But it's
unique.
to stop the reader, right? So I mean, so
Mm.
any kind of caesura in writing will always force the reader to stop. Now you could argue, well, you stop at the end of a line anyway, but it forces you not to go immediately to the next line. So it's declare, and of course that's how it's said, right? I mean, people say "Qul huwallahu ahad," but they will say "Qul"
Hmm.
alone and not say anything else. And Yeah, it works. It works reasonably well. At the end of Surah Kaf, there's a succession of three quls, and if memory serves, I translate those all in a different way. Yes, it's attest, affirm, declare, which seemed to me to capture a lot of what qul is trying to do.
No, you're right. So this has been a great conversation. And is there anything else you would like to share regarding the Quran or your work on the devotional Quran?
No, I'm grateful. I'm grateful for this opportunity to discuss what I've done. I think it's a wonderful podcast, and I'm glad it exposes people to different aspects of the tradition. In terms of my own work, I guess I should advertise my translation of Surah Yusuf as a play script, which is
Mm,
also an attempt to use the resources available within the within genre to try and show what a surah is doing successfully, right? So that surah is
hmm.
there's a lot of action, it's very cinematic. Uh,
Oh, wow.
so the idea of translating it as a play script was not so that it gets performed, but so that the the language form, the form of the language I've used, helps to underscore what the Quranic text is doing. And so I think
Mm.
what I'd urge people to do is to explore and be more creative. I think 20 years ago I might have had to say to be more daring, but I don't think there's really any real threat perceived anymore by translators doing interesting things with the Quran. I think if it's done with in good faith, with the right reasons in mind, Muslims or non-Muslims, if they're trying to just make, and every translator I have to say, including the ones who produce translations I don't like, have been driven in the last 75 years, have been driven by a desire to make the Quran more accessible. I don't think there's anything
Mhm.
out there to, it's not like in the 17th and 18th centuries when there was a disparaging of Islam. Now it's clear people don't spend their lives translating the Quran if they don't have a great deal of affection for it. So,
All right, great. Yeah, I look forward to reading that script and maybe having you again on the show. So,
fine.
yeah, thanks so much,
Not
Shawkat
at all.
Toorawa.
My pleasure.
And that was my interview with Shawkat Toorawa. So many things stood out to me in that interview. First, Shawkat is a unique scholar in that he's focusing on the sound of the Quran. And for the majority of Muslims, they hear the Quran and they're moved by its sonorous qualities. However, as he mentions, when you look at Quranic translations, they often focus on the meaning devoid of the sound. Through Shawkat Toorawa, we find that the needle is moving towards a translation that tries to capture the sound of the Quran. Second, we see with Shawkat a focus on the Quran and literature. Of course, the Quran is scripture. It's considered the word of God for Muslims and is sacred. But majority of times we look at the Quran in the context of religious studies and compare it to other scriptures like the Bible. However, with Shawkat, he comes with an amazing background in literature, and he's concerned about the sound, its poetic quality, and the various narrators and characters. Last, what struck me was the focus on making the Quran accessible. One of the challenges in teaching the Quran is that the Quran, as he mentions, is an ancient text. Some of its words are archaic. It speaks to a particular context, and many modern readers struggle to access its meanings. However, when you look at the translation of Toorawa, you understand the sonorous quality of the Quran. Many of its theological principles become more clear, and it begins to speak to the average reader. He is intentional about making the Quran accessible, but also understanding that the Quran has unique language and style that should be preserved. In conclusion, I want to thank all of you for listening to the Common Word and Islamic Mary podcast, which is available on major podcast streaming services such as Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You can visit the Maidan website for more podcasts, blogs, and videos. You can pre-order my book, The Islamic Mary, Maryam Through the Centuries, which should be coming out September 9th. You can visit my website to learn more about my bio, research, and blogs. And you can join my listserv to be updated about my research, speaking, and publications, especially my forthcoming book on the Islamic Mary. Thanks for listening to a Common Word podcast.